the only way to scale is to build security into the surroundings of developers. I heard far more positive attitude this year to how auditors are engaging in conversation. Security is this invisible thing, it doesn't have a natural feedback cycle, and it doesn't hurt until it hurts really bad. We need a model as an industry that people can replicate, and I think that has not yet been created. But if there was really one thing we can do, is to figure out how do we measure security, because you can't optimize what you can't measure. Hi, I'm Guy Podjarny, CEO and co-founder of Snyk, and you're listening to The Secure Developer, a podcast about security for developers, covering security tools and practices you can and should adopt into your development workflow. It is a part of the Secure Developer community. Check out thesecuredeveloper.com for great talks and content about developer security, and to ask questions and share your knowledge. The Secure Developer is brought to you by Heavybit, a program dedicated to helping startups take their developer products to market. For more information, visit heavybit.com. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to The Secure Developer. I'm Guy Podjarny, and today we're actually going to do something a little bit different where, hopefully not to your chagrin, I'm going to be the guest over here. And what we're going to do is we're going to look back at just sort of this year's episodes. We had so many of them, and try to just sort of reshare some of the themes and learnings that we've had from it. So to help us do that, I actually have with me Simon Maple from Snyk here to actually host the show and be the interviewer here. Thanks, Simon, for coming on.
My pleasure. It is a true pleasure to be on The Secure Developer, and I'm looking forward to asking you some searching questions about The Secure Developer in 2019. So yeah, just let's go through a couple of stats of what's been happening in 2019. We've had 20 episodes over the year. This is the 21st episode this year. And we have had so far 697 minutes of content with 21 guests over the year. So pretty interesting stats.
Yeah, no, and it's amazing how time flies forward. Definitely the most we've done in a single year, by a good margin here.
And let's talk about, of the 697 minutes, which was your favorite minute? No, I won't ask you that.
But we'll get very detailed here.
Yeah, let's go very detailed, yeah. But let's talk about, there's obviously, with 21 separate guests, I'm sure we were talking about, lots of different topics, but there's going to be some similar messages in there. So why don't we start with a question about what some of the recurring messages across the episodes were this year?
Well, there are definitely many different insights, as we went through it. So digging into some recurring things, definitely, maybe I like to ask a lot of the guests how they got into security. And one sort of interesting maybe observation, is maybe the lack of a theme here, which is, that there are very different answers to that question. There are many different paths to security. A more recent episode, we had Andy Ellis talk about how pretty much he got assigned to security when he was in the military, and he pretty much was told, presumably asked, but in practice not really, to do some work that's security, and that led him to his first job at Akamai, and I don't think it's quite 20, but it's sort of shy of 20 years later, he's the CISO there and doing an amazing job at a massive company. We had Tanya Janka talking about how she was organizing tech talks and had a lot of talks about security, and it was interesting, and then kind of got lured into it. A lot of people coming from software engineering jobs. We have, I think, Kate at The Guardian and Sarah at Envision, and various others talked about how they got into it. So that was interesting, like many different paths into security. I guess kind of related, when I spoke to Tanya, she does a lot of great work trying to get more people to get into security and does these sort of mentoring Mondays on Twitter, and just try to kind of, increase or sort of push for more of that diversity in security and different paths. So that was kind of one really interesting observation. Back into sort of more themes. So I think, there might be a little bit of a selection bias, but the whole notion of security and dev collaboration has been kind of a frequent topic. And I think one key observation is, we talk a lot about how we need developers to embrace security, but really what came up a lot this year was the other side of the fence, which is how do security teams need to change to foster such collaboration. And you could see this in past years as well, but I think it was really, really strong this year. There was a lot of like DevOps related references. So Duncan, who runs security at Auth0, talked about how his own team operates like a DevOps team and kind of own what they build and operate it and run it. There was a lot of a more kind of a broad view from Justin Soumeni, who talks a lot about the skill set that the different teams need to have, the security teams need to have, maybe going from more of a sysadmin type background into more of a software engineering, or maybe from a project management to more software engineering. You see things around team structures. So a lot of teams report to CTO and engineering organizations, and sometimes even comment how that's different. Actually, sneaking a little bit further back, and I think in 2018 we had an episode with the CISO of Slack, and Jeff was commenting on how it was actually a big deal to sort of make them be a part of the engineering organization. And this was echoed back in various episodes today. So definitely a lot of examples on how security teams have changed. The list goes on, right? Kate at The Guardian, she definitely sort of does a lot of work, building and writing software for the dev teams. And maybe one of the best sort of teams to give an example for is Segment, and we had Eric Ellett there talk about embedding. I think I actually kind of exposed some cover there. It was just before he was rolling out an embed program more officially, but around how his team embeds itself into development teams to help them build software. And Leaf there as well in the Segment team talked about walking a mile in a developer's code to do this. So all of these really talk a lot about empathy, and around how the security teams need to structure and change themselves to be able to collaborate better with the dev. And even that, like above and beyond their own structure and their theme, there was also a lot of conversation around how they should adopt this partnership mindset, right? This definitely came up a lot in Peter from Smartsheet talks about partnership a lot, sort of a lot of those types of quotes, and talking about how working with the dev teams, they shouldn't be saying no, they should be talking about how do we get to a yes. And, Mohan at Prudential was talking about this. So definitely a very strong recurring theme is how the security teams themselves need to change to fit this collaboration.
And with this collaboration and this partnership between developers and security, obviously it's a two-way street and both need to change. From a historical point of view, is it fair to say that developers, adopting more agile processes, adopting DevOps processes, would you say it would be potentially easier for them to take on security than it would be for security teams to change themselves? Because maybe more traditionally, there haven't been as many changes in the org structure of a security team versus a development team.
Yeah, I think the development teams, the change they're sort of experiencing is very much around digital transformation. And I guess that's also been a key theme here, especially when you look to the enterprise. So I think there are different, almost like these two cohorts of companies that came on as guests this year. And, there's the cloud native, more sort of born in a cloud, newer, less baggage type companies, from Auth0 to Segment to Smartsheet. And then you have a lot of enterprises. So when you look at in the enterprise side, that's really where development teams are changing how they develop software and change their org structure under that mantle of digital transformation. And there was a lot about how do they approach security and how should that change. We had some key episodes on that topic, but we had Justin Soumeni, who, if you've heard his episode, he's sort of ex of Box and Yahoo and Symantec and various. He's had very rich experience, and he talks. Actually, had this great quote there. He talked about how security is never going to be as agile as the lines of businesses. So you have to think about how does a distributed or integrated security model would work, right? Because it's the only way to sort of handle the day to day, and so. That was like more of a comment on how the security teams need to change, but it's due to a change in how development is being done. And similarly, we had James Kaplan from McKinsey, and he actually wrote this great article that triggered the podcast episodes talking about how, I think called it like cybersecurity is the linchpin of digital transformation, and how that should modify how you approach security. How if you don't do that, then really your options are either, slowing things down, which nobody wants to do, shipping insecure software, which clearly is not kind of an ideal, or the third option, which you aspire to, which is embedding security in. So that's definitely a dev team change. And we got a bit of a taste of that from the opposite side. We had Brian at Liberty Mutual was, really a great example of that, talking about he is on the dev side, and he talks about how he's basically ahead of the security team. So like they're embracing modern technology, and, they just know so much more about it than the security teams because they're living it. So sometimes they need to bring them along for the journey. And I think a little bit earlier in the journey was Mohan from Prudential, and he talks about how they're building that program, how they're building that sort of DevSecOps program. Yeah, and I guess going back to Andy a little bit at Akamai, it's interesting. He talks about the intrinsic security thing has actually been built early. He almost didn't know better, when he started, because it was his first job, and he built security to be core and a part of the responsibility of the ops teams and of the dev teams. But the change that they're undergoing is more about making things more agile. So they're already doing well to have teams own that responsibility. But now doing that as the dev teams become more agile and move faster, they do have to change how do they deal with security internally. And his security team, is helping them kind of scale up.
And when we see these changes in both security teams and development teams, where would you say the inertia exists, the greatest inertia exists? Because obviously people naturally want to continue doing what they're doing in day-to-day lives. And in all of our episodes, the guests from that we choose are obviously already doing security far better than many other teams and organizations that exist. Where would you say generally would be the inertia in other organizations, which some of the guests that we're talking to have already succeeded?
Probably the change that justifies a change, is really around DevOps, and it's around indeed that, you can call it digital transformation, you can talk it, DevOps, but DevOps does two things. One is, as DevOps gets embraced more and more in these companies, then the need to do something, like, things just change, you have to adapt, you have to fix it. But the other thing is that DevOps gives us this model, and there were a ton of references to how DevOps is a model throughout the show. We had Sarah at Envision talk about how they actually call they have a team called DevSecOps, which is more of like a cloud security infosec type team, and they actually call those people security SREs. There was definitely references on the dev side on how, hey, just like how we operate it, we also need to secure it. So probably the momentum comes from DevOps as well as the role model. So it both gets us going and it shows us the way to it.
And I guess, we've talked a lot about kind of maybe more from an AppSec point of view. If we think a little bit more about from a container point of view, is this very similar when it comes to things like ownership and when it comes to the model that is required within an organization, or are we really looking at different stakeholders there?
Yeah, I think if there's anything we can sort of say from these conversations or from this episode this year is that container security ownership is messy. It is very unclear. On one side, we see, I'd say, the more common pattern amidst guests. We think about Stu Hurst from Just Eat, or you think about Duncan at Auth0. You definitely see a lot of methodologies that are more VM-like. So they're thinking about containers as the evolution of the VM. Simon Bennett from Bitnami talked a lot about sort of the golden image and how do we handle it. But that approach really runs a little bit into a wall when it comes to the fact that, the Docker file sits in a repo and that patching a container requires running a build. So I think nobody's really quite comfortable. It's been the most natural thing to put container security and just patching this new breed of VMs in the cloud security, in the team that previously patched the VMs. But it's also seems pretty clear that it's not the destination. And today we're in flux. We're in that twilight zone today. So yeah, that's definitely come sort of shown very brightly through the many conversations.
Awesome. First of all, I must say, actually, the name-dropping level of this podcast so far has been set to expert in this episode. But it is actually a testament to the caliber of the guests that we've had on.
Absolutely. And each of them there's sound bites, there's quotes, there's these insights from it. I enjoy, really for me, this is for my own benefit, my own sort of selfish interest. I learned so much from every one of these episodes.
Excellent. So with the conversations that we've had with all of these podcast guests, let's take a step back and think maybe of the things that development teams or security teams are doing well, and what they need to improve. So let's think about, perhaps what people have shown to be doing well in 2019 and maybe want to improve going forward into 2020.
Sure. So there's definitely been, a lot of improvements. And I've had, we're talking about 2019, but I sense a bunch of these things and how good practices are being done and how that differed over the sort of 3 or so years of the podcast, right? Nearly 4 years. So what are we doing well? Definitely great emphasis on automation. I think this, really shone brightly, throughout the episodes, go from Simon Bennett, indeed, talking about Bitnami and golden images to, Tanya Janko was talking about security unit tests and how they're sort of fast and accurate. That also came up with Omer from Soluto earlier in the year. Dunkin' Not Zero. It's just there's been pretty much everybody's talking about how do you automate more. I liked Peter's phrasing. Peter from SmartSheet talked about how automation gives you leverage from technology and just thinks about this as an element of scale. So, and it really came up in the notion of scale or speed. So emphasis on automation, I think, is appropriate. I think we're doing well. Nobody's really quite happy at their level of automation, but the attention to automation is good.
And this is something I see day to day when I talk to customers. It's automation and speed is absolutely key. That, you know, when we're talking about pipelines, it's not just about how can we add something into a pipeline without manual intervention, but how can we do it in a way to keep developers happy by keeping these pipelines to, you know, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever, you know, something super quick that doesn't you know, require a half day or a day's turnaround in order to push something across to production.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a change because a lot of security solutions don't necessarily have it. And I guess that's the other bit that I would say is improving is it's also a change in the skill set. So definitely have heard much more this year that people are hiring, that security teams are hiring into their teams with an emphasis on software engineering abilities, you know, with hiring coders, hiring people that can program. And a lot of it comes back to that automation bit. Like some of that is empathy, but a lot of it is because they see themselves as more sort of service providers, as building tools, and they need to hire people who can build it. So, you know, definitely can clearly see the change in the hiring profile. I love, you know, Justin had a lot of sort of great sound bites there, you know, in his insights, but he talked about how teams should move from governance via advisory to governance via product delivery. And I know, you know, Peter talked a lot about skills. Definitely skills are evolving. I think we're doing that well, and it's still a path. And with that, you know, I think that skill set is, again, for building, but it's also for empathy. And I'd say the other thing that we're building an appreciation for is this importance of intrinsic security. It's almost this acceptance that the only way to scale is to build security into the surroundings of developers. And so, you know, various conversations about how you have to build security and integrate very elegantly into the tools that developers already use. How do you need to pull developers in and have them be a part of evaluating security tools? And, you know, they need to be a core constituent, otherwise it doesn't work. And that approach or that learning, you know, isn't just a learning on the security side that they should involve dev, but also dev learning how they do it. And again, kind of Liberty Mutual there with Brian and that sort of digital transformation project that they're running is a good example. Jeff McCaffer, who was at Microsoft at the time, talked about he was running their open source program, and security, it wasn't security, like that wasn't his job, but definitely was a lot of his attention, right, as we built that.
And it equally comes down to ownership as well, right? From a developer point of view, the approval or the committing to using these kind of tools, if the developer doesn't have the skin in the game of that initial adoption, then they're never going to own it, really.
Yeah, very much. It's the sort of it takes two to tango type approach. Like you can't get collaboration when only one side wants to do it. So both parties have to come to the table. And I guess one thing that as an industry, I guess we're doing a little bit better on this year, which I thought was very encouraging, is the approach of auditors and compliance people. So I heard far more positive attitude this year to how auditors are engaging in conversation about newer practices that empower developers. There's a certain amount of risk taking there, you know, and an auditor looking to see if you're compliant for PCI, for a variety of others, they need to accept that is a good way or, you know, an acceptable way to address one risk or the other. And I hearken back to one of the early episodes with Sean Gordon from New Relic, and he was kind of, you know, paving the path to being able to get sort of SOC 2 certified, you know, when you're enabling teams and you're not a draconian sort of naysayer. And he had to educate a bunch of auditors, and I think I told him then that we all owe him a beer for that, and I think he should really be quite drunk by now. Just sort of seeing the change that happens, you know, like just one of the recent ones with Dunkin' Not Zero talked a lot about how this is a healthy conversation with the auditors. So those are the things we're doing kind of well, I think, so far.
So it sounds like we can go for a beer ourselves then. It sounds like we're in a pretty good state ourselves.
Yeah, I think we still have a little bit of our work cut out for us.
There always is, isn't there?
Yeah. So I think for the areas that we need to improve clearly, first of all, like all of these things that we mentioned right now are evolved, but they're not done. So we need to do those. I'd say, one, part good, part bad was the whole conversation about security champions program. It came up so much during the sessions. It came up from trainer perspective with Jim Manico talking about security champions and how that's a key element. Omer at Soluto or Ashurian, Ashurian as a whole have these security mavens program that he's a part of. And, Tanya Janka, I think, kind of semi-started that way. So definitely a lot of conversation about champions and a lot of fondness to it, but very little structure. Like as an industry, we don't really know what makes a working security champions program. And I think we have a long ways to go to just sort of understand it. Even within a company, the conversation with Omer at the beginning of the year, a lot of it comes down to individual initiative, and it's not that clear. How do you encourage? How do you motivate those champions? How do you empower them to do the work?
I absolutely love the work that Ashurian did actually with the security mavens. I think it's really important by educating developers, and I think they use their security team to educate their own developers as well, somewhat.
Indeed.
And it's less of a them and us kind of model, right? As soon as you have such detailed security knowledge within the development team, I was talking to Mark, one of the folks at Ashurian as well, and he was mentioning to me about how much once they got that model in, that champion program in, how much more the security and developers talked. Not just through the security maven to the security team, but just in general across teams, the interaction was far greater.
Yeah, I think they're a great, and everybody acknowledges that they're a great path to better connect the two teams, the sort of the development side and security side, and also to scale the security teams, because they're not full-time security people, but there are people that carry a partial security responsibility, but there are many more of them than there are in dev. But I do think that nobody really has a winning formula. Nobody really has a model that should be replicated or a structure. So I think we should kind of go forward and just like evolve that as an industry.
And why do you think that is? Because it seems like, okay, it may differ a little bit from company to company and team to team, but the idea of pulling knowledge and information from security teams into development teams, it seems, I don't want to say maybe a little bit ignorantly that it's a simple thing to do, but it's the idea of having security champions in development teams. Why is that not something that can be easily replicated?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is really around expectations of what is to be accomplished and what's the division of ownership. So you see this with, even with that sort of Mavens program, or I had conversations with Autodesk or, outside the podcast around their security champions program, and everybody looking to roll it out. It's not entirely clear. They know they want the security champions to amplify, but if it's not entirely clear what the security champion does, then it's hard for the development teams around to know when to approach that person. And it's hard for the security teams to sort of know what to expect that person to have been done. It's hard for that person's management to know how much time to allocate to them. So what it ends up being, which is very useful, a community. So security champions collaborate with one another and they learn. It ends up being a sensor. So, a person inside a dev team hears more about what's happening in that dev team. And when there's a security related, there's a consideration about security, they raise that flag. So that's valuable as well. And it ends up being like an empathy vehicle, because if there's a healthier conversation between the security team and the slightly smaller cohort of champions, then they're able to collaborate more effectively. But it's just hard to know how, so it creates almost more of a community, but it doesn't create a program. It's not clear that you can say, well, the security champion will do security reviews. It's not clear that the security champion would get involved in security tooling. And some of them do, like Omer at Soluto does a ton of actual concrete build security into the pipeline work. But he's not the norm. It's more because he is very passionate and takes initiative versus having kind of the program structure. So I think the fact we're embracing it is a positive thing, and everybody's, I've really heard no negativity around it. But the notion of how do you replicate it, not everybody can be a leader. We need a model as an industry that people can replicate. And I think that has not yet been created.
And is this problem somewhat compounded when we think about container security, whereby the ownership of that sometimes exists in various different teams, depending on which org or company you're talking to at the time?
Yeah. And container security is indeed, as we referenced before, definitely an area for improvement around, that type of ownership. And that one introduces another couple of teams to the mix, which is the DevOps team. So oftentimes container container security kind of falls not necessarily to the writers of the software, but to the maintainers of the infrastructure. And sometimes there's a dedicated cloud security or infrastructure security or, various names for this team. And definitely yet another sort of aspect of security that kicks in. So it's really like I would definitely say that if security champions is one, container security ownership is another manifestation of ownership challenges and definitely another area to improve. And then maybe underlying all of those, one of the areas that I would most love to see us improve is measuring security. It actually didn't come up as much in the podcast episodes because nobody really had like great insights to share almost on it. I would very often in the sort of the quick prep that we do ahead of episodes ask people about measuring security. And it's just so clear that measuring security is a beast, and nobody really feels like they've tamed it. Security is this invisible thing. It doesn't have a natural feedback cycle, and it doesn't hurt until it hurts really bad. And measuring security ends up measuring activities, measuring what are not optimal leading indicators to how secure you are, like, putting an SLA into knowing how many vulnerabilities do you have, or putting an SLA to how quickly you remediate them, or just assessing whether security controls are in place. So you're measuring things that are very much to the side. Nobody's really convinced that they are the best measure of how secure they are. So I get the sense that we're going to get to the end of 2020 and we're not actually going to have a full-on solution to how do we measure security. But if there was really one thing we can do to truly move the needle, is to figure out how do we measure security, because you can't optimize what you can't measure, right? We have to get that barometer. So that's definitely an area that we need some serious improvement on.
And let's continue with the thoughts of what's going to happen in 2020. Let's talk about, with the guests that you talk to throughout the episodes, what are their specific challenges that they're going to have in security in their organizations?
I think one very obvious one is just one of scale. So a lot of references to security hygiene at scale, as we move to the world of cloud. Anywhere from, talking about Jeff McCaffer at Microsoft, talking about Microsoft scale and how they had to build things in-house just to be able to track which libraries and which components they're using, given the scale of Microsoft, and then adapt how do they scale handling vulnerabilities of open source components as part of the sort of the development process within Microsoft, and how hard that problem is to do it at the volume of work they do. Jason Chan described the same problem, but they tackled it in a much more decentralized way of more empowering developers to do it and building tools to help those developers know what they're doing. But really, security hygiene at scale, doing basic things like indeed keeping your dependencies, patched and vulnerability free, which isn't, you can do it very easily for one library. You can do it pretty easily for 10 libraries. Doing it for 10,000 libraries gets pretty darn hard. That's definitely the recurring theme. And we've seen also, like we had Liran on the show talking about the state of open source security, and he shared some alarming stats about that, talking about the 88% increase in app library vulnerabilities. So we're finding more security issues and we're not really addressing them, right? We had the top 10 Docker images that have a bunch of dependencies in them, the top 10 having at least 30 vulnerabilities each. And we're talking about how also the scene itself is getting increasingly complex. It's not about the 10 libraries that you pulled into your app. It's really the vast majority, sort of 4 in 5 vulnerabilities that get discovered is in an indirect dependencies, not in the 10 libraries you used, but rather in the 500 libraries that they in turn pulled in.
And it was 78%, in fact, in indirect libraries. And did these kind of numbers, did they shock you? Did they surprise you? Or were they really a kind of reaffirmation of what you already believed?
Well, I don't think this is news. I think it's just, we're seeing it happen, in scale. So cloud technology and open source and a variety of these technology adoptions and containers are now starting to get rolled out at scale. So we're now experiencing the explosion. There's an order of magnitude more containers than there were VMs, right? That in turn was an order of magnitude more than physical machines. So more volume implies kind of more risk. And it's not really a terribly new problem. It's just a new manifestation when we think about, wrangling servers and how patching your servers is a really big problem, even when these were like data center machines. And so there's definitely just another order of magnitude. So it doesn't really surprise me. It also manifests in the cloud security side. So you definitely see Duncan and Auth0 talked about how they have 150 accounts. I think Stu at Just Eat talked about 100 AWS accounts. And it's not natural. It's not obvious for you to think that a company would have more than one AWS account, right? Or two or three. Why do they have 100? But it's really that empowerment, the different teams that can operate and can run at a fast pace and agility and not ask for permissions implies you get fragmentation. Now the challenge, really, the name of the game is around how do you help embrace that agility and that speed without breaking. And you have like Netflix launched a Repo Kid as a tool. You empower the teams over there. There's a whole set of tools and technologies and approaches that happen, but some people revert into that centralized, can I still contain that agility, while versus others that are trying to sort of more embrace the chaos and just empower the teams to run it. I don't see that problem diminishing in 2020. I think that continues to be, everybody mentions those as one of their biggest challenge. I think the second big challenge, which is very related, I was referring to like centralized versus decentralized, is cultural change, especially for companies that move it. Look, embracing good tech or new tech is hard enough, in terms of like the time that is needed, but replacing people's attitudes and sometimes people themselves, sort of people's skill set is really, really hard. So this definitely came up a lot, especially when we touched on the enterprise. I mentioned some of this before, but some of this is indeed in that sort of skill set change. One slightly ominous prediction, if you will, was in Justin Somaini saying that he thinks about a third, maybe half of security team staff will rotate. I don't think he gave like an exact time frame there, but when you think about that, that's a fairly alarming stat for many security people, right? And a lot of it is that shift into it's a result of the culture change. It's a result of what is the role of the security team, within the company, and therefore what are the skills that you need within the security team. Again, we heard kind of, you see the magnitude of the program that Mohan at Prudential is trying to roll out and how it touches every different aspect of the organization. And you also see this, like, James from McKinsey was talking, like, he really gives a deep kind of overview of how companies should be embracing that change and how do they justify it to the business, because these are expensive propositions. But really, alongside technologically, it's really about security hygiene at scale. But right alongside it is this culture shift, this sort of change. And we have great role models in the modern companies, in these like cloud native companies, in Envision, in Segment, in One Medical. But for enterprises, it's still very much a work in progress. So I'd say those are kind of the primary, like this security hygiene at scale on one side, and the kind of the culture change plus that sort of skill set shift are probably the biggest challenges that the security industry and security teams face in 2020.
So with so many amazing guests that we've had on the Secure Developer over the last year, and in fact, as you mentioned, the last few, in terms of what you've learned from our guests, what would you say the most important things are, and maybe some of the things that you've sometimes thought, well, maybe we can do that in our org as well as what others can consider making changes in their own organizations? Yeah,
there were so many episodes that I felt like, left to my own devices, I can go on for an hour or two more. So my probably, sort of two biggest insights are related, and they're really around that sort of change in the scope of the application and how it relates to cloud. So, maybe thinking first about that cloud piece, a lot of conversations around the difference between AppSec, or sometimes it's referred to as product security, and cloud security. And this relates to that container security ownership mess, but really it's around this cloud as a whole. And I asked Stu, for instance, in the recent episode, asked him, okay, like, what is the difference, or like, why are containers not owned by cloud security, which is kind of his neck of the woods, versus not product security? Are they not there? And he was saying, well, I think it's the start of a journey, and they probably should eventually land over there. But today they work in CloudSec and they're different. I asked Sarah at Envision around. They have this sort of great model where the AppSec teams are aligned to dev teams and they collaborate really well over there, but they have a separate team they call DevSecOps, and they refer to people there as security SREs. And asked her, well, like, how are those different than, like, do they work with dev as well? And says, well, they do work in dev. And it sounds like there's a lot of like well-minded individuals in these companies. Auth0 is another example. So it works, but I feel like that delineation surprised me a little bit. I guess I came at it from a slightly more dev-minded view, and I thought like a lot of these aspects of cloud, of the application of containers, they're just an evolution of the app, and therefore clearly they should be a part of AppSec, or definitely a part of ProductSec, if that's how you defined it. But in many ways, these cloud security bits are an evolution of infrastructure security. They're more an evolution of maybe the sysadmins and what you've done to sort of patch your servers indeed. And so that's sort of one aspect that I've learned, is just that there's a very interesting line, and I think there's more to explore over there, between cloud security and its various names and AppSec, and where should they stay different and where should they be the same. But I definitely have learned that is not that given. And then sort of related to that is maybe this growing realization, which has never been said explicitly, about the growing scope of the application, and how really to an extent it's because when we say app, we don't always mean the same thing, and that the application has really changed in nature. And sometimes you think about app and you think about code and libraries, but oftentimes in a modern world, you think about an app, you think about, so much more, about the containers, about the network layer, about so many things. And so definitely, I think it was Jason at Netflix, Jason Chan, who talked about how there's really like this line between infrastructure and the network kind of goes away with cloud, because now it's the infrastructure, the network is just embedded in. And I think there's basically another line, another layer there that is into the app itself, right? The line between the infrastructure and the app, does that go away? So I think that's probably like my most meta perspective. And I think on sort of a practical, how should you approach security, I loved some of the guidance that I got around focusing on the threats. I was surprised, and I think in hindsight, surprised for the better, just the frequency that even when we talk about developers and security, the answer oftentimes reverted or went back to talking about threat models. And, Peter at Smartsheet talked about how threat models create sometimes this Pavlovian response from teams, and therefore he sometimes sort of avoids the term. But really, you can call it security design review. It's still a threat model. Really, what you want to do, and that was the recurring theme, is you want to understand what are the attackers doing so that you can tune your activities versus over-investing in an area that doesn't matter and staying exposed on an area that does. So that element, and how embedding that into your developer security collaboration, and maybe tying back to that security hygiene at scale, how important a role it plays there, was definitely great insight for me.
Mm-hmm. And from a listener point of view, I guess there's going to be a lot of people out there working in security teams, working in developer teams, love all the kind of high level discussion, but when it comes to the actual day-to-day roles, what can they take away? What actionable things can they do to actually start implementing some of these ideas?
Yeah, for sure. I think there were like a ton of concrete tips, just very explicit, like do this, don't do that type elements. I also like to sort of ask that question at the end of every episode, ask people, what's your one pet peeve or one piece of advice? And I love how different guests take it in very different directions. So some key ones that I liked, definitely a lot great practices around celebrating success and how that's key for developer adoption. Just sort of basic human properties is you have to, you can't just reprimand people for doing something wrong. You also have to celebrate it when they do it right. This came up throughout the years, but I think some really good tips. We had Siren Hofvander talking about, kind of making cakes for nothing, for basically for nothing happening, just sort of making those, or she's definitely sort of big on the positive reinforcement. Zach at One Medical, which I think I'm actually slipping a little bit into the previous year, talked about hoodie-driven security and how they give those. That came up earlier as well with T-shirts, even all the way back to Optimizer, which I think might be my first episode on the show. Like the segment team gives stickers at the end of like these unique stickers that you only get if you've passed security training. So definitely positive security, celebrating people that do it well, anywhere from stickers and hoodies to just giving exposure and recognition to someone who does something well was a great tip.
It's the swag-driven development model.
It is. It works.
Like it,
We're all just humans. There was a lot of focus on scaling security basics before you move on to the next sort of shiny thing. So I referred to that a little bit before, but security hygiene at scale. But I think for a concrete tip is like, put aside the advanced persistent threat and, sort of the funky new attack vector and just, invest in automation and in how do you scale activities. And there were some concrete things like, can try to reuse tools from the ops side of the fence to apply them to security, make sure that security is embedded elegantly into your development environment, so you're not asking developers to log on to yet another portal and work over there. Org-wise, concrete advice about aligning security teams to dev teams. I most liked Envision's model, where they literally take, like, you think a lot of companies do these finance teams or HR teams have this HR partner to these different business units. So Envision embraced something similar for security, and their AppSec teams are basically aligned. Every AppSec engineer has a set of development teams that they support, which I really liked. The team still works as a team, but their primary affinity almost is into these dev teams that they work, and therefore they can embed, they can be a part of that. And then I guess last is something that I've totally embedded into my vocabulary, is this notion of the paved road. So this, I think the first time I heard it was from Jason Chan at Netflix, but it definitely came out more later on. And this is the idea that one way to manage, to balance agility of the different teams with some consistency and methodology across the company is to create a paved road, to say, here's a set of practices, tools, that we, the security teams, support, and we make it super easy for you to use that paved road. Just stay on the paved road, and life is going to be easier. If you want to go off the road, and you want to go on the dirt, then you can, but it's going to be harder, right? You need to take on a bit more responsibility. You need to do more of the work yourself because we haven't paved it for you. So I really, really liked that approach, and I think that's a concrete approach that then people can do, is even just sort of sit down and define what is the paved road, as opposed to just this like nihilist, you can do anything, there are no rules, we'll just match you, development team, or the draconian, no, you do it our way or the highway, type approach. I thought it was a really good middle.
Great. And let's look forward again to 2020 and perhaps offer the classic dinner guest, your ideal dinner guest style question for a meal. Who would be your ideal guests and perhaps topics of some of your 2020 episodes going forward?
It's hard to point to a specific guest. I have, I think, a great topic that I have in mind. I think a guest is, there are many people I want to talk to. And I'm fortunate enough that there are actually a few of those already scheduled. From a topic perspective, the one that interests me the most is indeed this notion of like unraveling cloud security. It feels so messy, where on one hand, it's a very clear and immediate need to wrangle these, 100 plus AWS accounts. We see all the security breaches that happen by super capable security teams because, they missed some file, one file. And so definitely super important, but I feel like it's not clear where it's headed. It's not clear whether, first of all, like terminology is a mess. You talk about SecOps teams and you see, on one hand, you see the same name, SecOps, is a team that handles kind of detection and response, in Just Eat, in kind of Stu Hurst's world. And in Auth0, that very same name is actually more of an SRE, more of an engineering team that builds platform, and there's a separate detection and response team, right? Or, in Vision, that same team is called DevSecOps, and, SmartSheet calls it infrastructure security. So are these things the same? Are they different? Where should they be headed? So, this whole aspect of the infrastructure that moves into the scope of the app, what is the future of securing this sort of app-led infrastructure? And
do you think they will converge to a common home across the different companies, or do you think it's okay for them to just exist in different parts of the organization based on the company?
I think the short answer is I don't know, but I feel like there's going to be an aspect of what is currently CloudSec that needs to move into AppSec because it becomes such an intrinsic part of the application that how you deal with it. Once again, like AppSec is a supporting organization for dev. They do a lot of responsibility themselves, but they can only scale through development. And DevOps is a supporting organization for dev, once again. So the same notion, they build a bunch of stuff themselves and they do a lot of the work, but to scale, they need to get the dev teams to sort of build operable software. And so cloud security is a little bit weird because it's a supporting organization to two supporting organization almost, right? Like, they help DevOps on one side, they help AppSec on the other. And then they kind of help dev as well. And it's not entirely clear where that's headed. And of course, they have their own responsibilities and direct ownership. That's more the infra security side. So I feel just the definition of it needs to shift. And there are portions of it that needs to move to AppSec and become just a part of the product. portion of it that needs to be embedded into your APM platforms, into your infrastructure monitoring platforms, and actually move to DevOps. And we see a lot of this. We see a lot of platform teams kind of owning security aspects. Definitely we see it in sort of Snyk's world. And then there's probably still a missing piece there, which is indeed wrangling the infrastructure security, what used to be the data center security or the server security. And I don't know what that looks like. Does that just get embedded into DevOps? Does it live long term? So yeah, I don't know. Selfishly, one of the reasons I want this topic to be dug into is because I want to end 2020 with a more crisp answer.
Excellent. And Guy, to finish off, one of the questions, I'm going to spring this on you now. One of the questions that you said you ask on pretty much every guest at the end of every episode is what your pet peeve would be, or what advice you would give to your listeners. So I ask you, Guy Podjarny, to hear, given that we've got you as our captive guest now, what is your one pet peeve or piece of advice that you would give to listeners?
I think my primary piece of advice would be to focus on the future, not the past. I think all too often, when you look at a security problem or security solutions, people judge it based on current reality and what they have previously seen, versus taking a moment and say, where do I want to be in 2 years' time? What do I think the world would look like in 2 years' time? And then, the security solution you implement needs to, or whether it's like org hires, or it's a tool that you purchase, or it's a methodology or process that you're sort of doing in your organization, no matter what it is, clearly it needs to serve today's needs, otherwise it's no good. But it needs to be a solution that helps you get to that destination versus one that holds you back. Otherwise, security is always going to be behind. The only way to get ahead is to implement solutions that think about where is it that you're headed. And oftentimes your company will have a path. You just need to know it. What is the path? What is the technology landscape? You can figure out, you can take your best guess about what's the market kind of landscape and, the adversary landscape. And just make that your first question, and then present, and only then past. If you don't do that, then every year you're going to need to reorg and rehire and retool everything you do.
Wonderful, Guy. It's been an absolute pleasure. I guess being invited onto this podcast and asking you some wonderful questions. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Simon, for being a great interviewer here. And we'll see. Maybe I'll pull you in to sort of help.
Oh no, not again.
Bunch of those. And thanks everybody for tuning into it. I think this is a good time to talk a little bit about more sort of structural changes that we're doing. We had an amazing year here, kind of in the Security Developer Podcast. We've had more episodes than ever, really, and we pulled in. If you've noticed, kind of outside, we've pulled in over the course of 2019. We've pulled in the security developer into a part of my DevSecOps as a broader community. And what we're going to do in 2020 is move it off where the podcast is hosted today, which is HeavyBit, and onto the My DevSecOps platform. So HeavyBit, which you've probably heard many times at the sort of the opening to this podcast, is a great program that Snyk is a part of that really helps kind of developer tools build up and shine and have great assets in them. And they've graciously been hosting and helping us kind of make this podcast happen over the past few years. And we're still very involved. We're engaged with them as we engage in more and more community activity and just sort of broaden the scope of security education and collaboration we foster here under My DevSecOps. We felt like the right home for this to be, right alongside those. And so you can expect the podcast to move to My DevSecOps. We're also relating the podcast to a lot of the activities we're doing online and in DevSecCon, which is a great conference that we also kind of help, accelerate and amplify here at Snyk. And what we're going to do is we actually recorded some DevSecCon episodes, some special episodes that maybe use some of the great content that we have on stage at DevSecCon, as well as some great conversations we've had with speakers from that event. So you can expect that coming in 2020. And then in general, just sort of have kind of cadence or sort of keep up the cadence. So Sam has joined us. You don't know her, but behind the scenes, Sam Hepburn has been driving a lot of this kind of growth in cadence and in amplifying and in quality of content over here. So thanks, Sam, for being a part of it. And with her help and the community team here, we will build up that, keep up the cadence, have an episode at least every 2 weeks. So by the end of 2020, we actually have even more episodes than the records that we've broken this year. So that's it. That's a wrap for 2019. Hope you enjoy the show. Thanks everybody for tuning in to this episode and for the shows this year. I hope you have a great break, and I hope to see you both in the new year and in the next episodes. That's all we have time for today. If you'd like to come on as a guest on this show or get involved in this community, find us at thesecuredeveloper.com or on Twitter @thesecuredev. Visit heavybit.com to find additional episodes, full transcriptions, and other great podcasts. See you next time.